Welcome everybody to another of our series of programs this year on topics of interest to Armenians. Today we have I think, a very interesting program and a most interesting speaker that I'm sure you're going to enjoy. The image of the Armenians among non-Armenians is important to all of us. How we are perceived and thought about determines to a great extent what people, even governments in other countries, do for us. What we think of ourselves and what others think may not be the same. During World War I, for example, we were thought of as the starving Armenians. That image lasted for a long time. In the Middle East, we were considered second only to the Jew in terms of shrewdness and success in financial dealings. Both images have a negative connotation. In fact, one writer who has submitted a manuscript to us contends that the image of the Armenians is more negative than positive, and that active measures need to be taken to change this image. For indeed, the very fate of the young Republic of Armenia may hinge on the image and perception of the Armenians as much as on the vital national interests of Armenia and the countries with which it is in interrelations. International relations is based not only on national interests, but as well on perceptions and images, especially when the media gets involved. Today, there is a whole new generation of writers and authors who are in their own individual ways attempting to deal with this matter of image. There has been recently a virtual proliferation of books, mostly novels based on history and survivor tales and generational problems, dealing directly or indirectly with the matter of image. The more recent ones are published by first-line commercial publishers, just to name a few. Mamigon by Jack Hashan, Garung by Peter Khanbegyan, Asking the River by David Kharijian, Pogrom by Alexander Shahinian, Love and Rutabaga by Claire Hasu Akamando, and the latest one that just come out, Rise the Euphrates by Carol Edgaryan. All of these are novels, but they're based on historical events, tales of survivors, and in all of them there's a very clear attempt to picture the Armenian in the way he should be pictured. Not the least of these are the efforts of our speaker, who has authored two non-fictional works, The Serpent and the Bees, and A Crime for Vengeance. And both of them are published by first-rate American publishers. And he has in the works now a novel called Opus, which I don't know whether it's been accepted for publication yet, but I'm sure will be published soon. Both as a diplomat and as a writer, Edward Alexander has been dealing with the image of the Armenians practically all of his life. He's a retired Foreign Service officer who has served in Budapest, Athens, and East Berlin, veritable hotspots in Eastern Europe, where he has helped to establish the first Voice of America broadcast to the Soviet blocs. He's a native of New York City, attended Columbia College and Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. During World War II, he served in psychological warfare in the European theater of operations. In 1950, the State Department asked him to organize several of the Caucasian language units of the Voice of America, and then appointed him chief of the Armenian desk. 8 years later, he transferred to the Foreign Service, where he dealt primarily with Soviet and East European affairs, on which he has written extensively. Since retiring from the Foreign Service in 1980, he has worked at the Board for International Broadcasting, which oversees the Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, in the State Department's Freedom of Information Division, and at the Voice of America. Most recently, he has served as Public Affairs Advisor on the U.S. delegation to Helsinki Human Rights Conferences in Ottawa, Budapest, and Bern. Presently, he is, in addition to the writing that he does, he is consultant and advisor to various government agencies on Armenian and related affairs. I haven't had a chance to ask Ed whether he is or isn't, but I would presume, from my knowledge, he's probably the first person of Armenian descent who was a diplomat for the United States government, going back to shortly after World War II. So it gives me, and I'm sure it will give you a great deal of pleasure, to welcome Edward Alexander.
Thank you very much, Monarch, for that introduction, and to NAASR for inviting me this evening. And I thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. The subject I have chosen for my talk is the Armenian image. The subject I have chosen for my talk is the Armenian image, by which I mean, how do others see us? More specifically, how do Americans view us? Where do they place us in their society? And what do they think of us when they hear the word Armenian? And not irrelevant to this theme, how much do they really know about us, and what can we do about that? This is a major subject for Armenians, and one which is not easy to address. I don't stand before you as an authority. I'm neither a university professor, nor a sociologist, nor an anthropologist. But as an American Armenian, I am concerned about attitudes towards my compatriots. And tonight, with your permission, I'd like to share some of my thoughts with you. After many years abroad on diplomatic assignments, I returned to the United States in 1980 and decided it was time to retire. The State Department was very cooperative. They said I had to retire. I had reached the mandatory retirement age. 3 months later, a law was passed raising that age, but I was very happy that I had done what I had done. My happiness was short-lived, however. I officially retired on a Friday, and on Monday morning I was called back to work on contract. I remained on contract for 10 years. So much for retirement. In a sense, however, I had a great advantage. My duties were such that I could schedule my own work time, which meant I was free to indulge my other interests. But in time, I found that none of my leisure activities fully satisfied my intellect or my soul. I knew, however, that what would fulfill me far more. For ever since returning, I had come to a revelation about myself and about the heritage of which I was a part. In my many years in European countries, primarily communist countries, I, and my wife as well, always sought out Armenians wherever we went, whether we were assigned to a country or visiting, just passing through. In this way, we found Armenians in Germany, in Hungary, in Russia, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Greece, and in Cyprus. We also found a few Armenians in Armenia. We helped them when we could, and in doing so, we helped ourselves by nourishing the Armenian spirit within us. So that when we returned to the United States, I was more infused with my ethnic heritage than when I had left. That may seem like a strong statement to make, because as some of you may know, and as Monarch has said, I began my government career at the Voice of America's Armenian service, directing broadcasts to Soviet Armenia, which meant that for the 8 years that I was there, I was thoroughly imbued with the culture and the language of my forefathers. Now I was back in the United States, and when time permitted, I began to catch up with the life of the American Armenian community, from which I had been away for more than 20 years. Sad to say, I found that just about nothing had changed. Armenians were still living their ethnocentric lives. They were still arguing about church unity. They were still at odds politically. What an understatement that is. And still boasting about the great achievements of the Armenian past, but not reflecting that past. As time went on, and I delved deeper into this, I found that the younger generation of American Armenians were gradually but inexorably carving out a niche for themselves. Armenian scholars, artists, historians, doctors, psychologists, chemists, and scientists of every kind were establishing reputations throughout the United States. But I had to dig deep to discover this. Meanwhile, the Armenian press continued to beat the drum on the same old issues. I asked myself, did almost 1 million Armenians flee persecution and come to the Western world in order to insulate themselves from the great progressive forces of the most democratic society the world has ever seen, a society filled with unimaginable potential? The answer I gave myself was apparently they did. I am talking now about the overwhelming majority of the first and second wave of Armenians, these immigrants who, when they came, began to turn inward, began to almost stop from where they had been. Where was that stimulating Armenian presence that we have always been talking about? Well, perhaps some of you know the work of Hashan, who says, quote, "The constant presence of a genocide mentality and its effects, that is a main problem. There is an urgent need for catharsis of the poison of hatred and negativism in the Armenian spirit, so as to enable creative energies to manifest themselves." End of Hashan's quote. It was the offspring of the generation Hashan is referring to, which, while retaining many of the Armenian values we cherish, sought to harness their creative energies by seizing the opportunities which American society offered them. Some of them are here this evening. The impact that this new generation of American Armenians is going to have will become evident as time progresses and the American public becomes accustomed to seeing Armenian names in newspapers and on motion picture and television screens, in scientific journals, in art magazines, in theater playbills and book reviews. I hesitate to predict what that impact will be. And the reason I hesitate is because I'm reminded of something that the former communist Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai, if you remember, Henry Kissinger said he was the most brilliant man he had ever met. Zhou Enlai was once asked what he thought were the consequences of the French Revolution. And Zhou replied, "It's too early to say." So if 200 years is premature for someone as wise as Zhou Enlai, who am I to describe the effect that a new generation of Armenians is going to have in the United States and on the world? But it is happening today all around us, and not only displays the genius of Armenian resurgence and native intelligence, but it also helps to dispel an image of the Armenian which is often distorted, often pejorative, and very, very often just plain wrong. Armenians themselves are largely to blame for establishing in the minds of their newfound countrymen the image of an immigrant generation which seemed to resist accepting and absorbing a new environment, a new set of values. Now, you and I can understand this up to a point. The issue here is loss of a culture, language, tradition, church, folk art, everything that is embraced in the concept of Armenianism. This is a strange word, Armenianism, conveying actually very little, and not at all as meaningful to us as our word, hayotun. We also know and appreciate how Armenians throughout the world have clung tenaciously to their hayotun, resisting that great demon of destruction, the white massacre, or as we say, the spidak chart. So we have an older generation struggling against the gradual erosion of Armenian culture in the New World, and we have the dilemma facing our present generation, which seeks to join the mainstream of American society, even as it tries, at the urging of its elders, not to shed the symbols and the values of its glorious past. Look at this phenomenon from the standpoint of Americans. They have neither the time nor the patience to separate the two generations, nor do they have the will or even the inclination to divest their minds of the image they have steadfastly held of Armenians. Let us now look at that image. How do Americans perceive us? What is the Armenian image projected in American society? The single most influential medium for crystallizing an ethnic image has been, until television and political correctness, the motion picture. The foremost Armenian actor in Hollywood was Akim Tamidov, who always played a Russian, never an Armenian. And no one ever knew that his name was really Tamiryans, or even that he was Armenian. So, we have not as yet been elevated in the movies to an ethnic stereotype such as those I have mentioned. Therefore, if you ask an American to describe an Armenian, he'll shrug his shoulders and shake his head. We all have a very human tendency to immediately impose on an entire ethnic group a personal prejudice. To date, however, we have been fortunate in not earning a one-word label. But time is against us. Quite frankly, I am worried that at some time a stereotype will be developed. I am worried because here and there, in small ways, there are signs that such a stereotype is in the making. Permit me to give you some examples. I don't know how many of you have read or know a book called The American Language. Its author is H.L. Mencken, a brilliant essayist and commentator on American society who died a few years ago. Mencken's book discusses the changes in English in the United States, and in its latter half examines the impact that the English language has had on immigrants when speaking their own native foreign languages. You can imagine my surprise when, after sections devoted to Germans, Spaniards, Arabs, Greeks, even Gypsies, and many, many others, I came across a section on the Armenians. And what did I find? Mencken gives examples of how Armenians are assimilating the English language. Listen to this. Bosses is fire arav. Lawyerin katsi businessi hamar. Good time when it's up. I'm sure not at the lawyers, though. I'm a nervous golam gor. I was getting nervous just reading all that. I was also saddened because this was a caricature and even demeaning. Do we talk like that? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. To one another in our everyday communication, when we are utterly relaxed and with parents and friends. You might say, but don't other nationalities in the United States do the same thing? To which I would reply, yes, of course, but I'm concerned only with the Armenians tonight. On the other hand, let me explain that many others employ what Mencken calls Americanisms. I'll give you some examples from the Italians. He gives us as two examples here. The Italian immigrants who call, you know, the Black Hand Society. If you've seen The Godfather, you'll never forget the man in the white suit who was a member of the precursor of the mafia. Italian immigrants call that the Blacko Enze, Black Hand. Blacko Enze. Or how do you like this one? Oazomaro. This is from Mencken. That means what's the matter? Oazomaro. Those are terrible distortions of American English, which the Armenians, especially in the examples cited, do not practice. You perhaps have heard of franglais. If you've been to France, you couldn't possibly ignore that. This is where in the French, for instance, have adopted certain words because there are no French equivalents. Drugstore is not just an apothecary as we know it. It is much more. And when you walk along the Champs-Élysées these days, you will see big neon lights saying drugstore. Another word frequently heard in France is weekend, for which there is no French equivalent. But what we are considering is something very different. The use of English words for which there are very definite Armenian counterparts. The point about image I wish to make here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the examples from Mencken's book not be confused by the Americans with the cultivated speech of cultured Armenians. The Mencken examples, if used in literature, would perhaps reflect the process of assimilation of the Armenians into American society, but they do not portray a people with a great cultural past, a culture which goes back almost 2,000 years, which had an alphabet and a literature long before many other nations even had an identity. I think we can agree that these examples do not make positive contributions to the image of Armenians as a people of cultural vitality and cultural diversity. Let me turn now to another indicator of the development of the Armenian stereotype, the media. Much of an ethnic image is formed in the public mind primarily by newspaper and television news, and interestingly, because it is usually, and sadly, bad news. Armenians come off not as perpetrators of crime, but as victims. We are not murderers, thieves, and gangsters. On the contrary, we are the targets. The targets of crime. But oddly, this contributes to our public image. In a perverse sort of way, actually, because many acts of crime are committed against Armenian businesses, which are depicted in the news either as vandalized jewelry shops, drugstores, restaurants, bookmarts, or all the other small enterprises that Armenians engage in. Thus, in time, in the public mind, Armenians come off generally as a nation of merchants. In very recent times, in the 70s and 80s, we did briefly appear to be advocating violence. We were seen as remnants of a victimized nation seeking revenge for persecution, and I am referring here, of course, to the wave of assassinations of Turkish diplomats by Asala and the Justice Commandos. For some 15 years, the nightly television news introduced and repeated endlessly the phrase Armenian terrorism, making it seem as though the entire Armenian nation was responsible for what you and I know was the work of an extremist minority. Now, the parameters of terrorism were expanded from the PLO, the Basques, and other aggrieved peoples to embrace the Armenians. Armenian terrorism. Think of the irony of that, ladies and gentlemen. The Armenian people, victim of the most monstrous state-sponsored terrorism in the history of the world, had now become labeled terrorists themselves. That is how, to the public media, much of our image was formed. In literature, it was not much better, and here I draw on the writings of Professor Leo Hamadyan. In book after book of American novels and short stories, some in hardcovers, others in magazines, we find Armenians to be rug dealers, barbers, shoemakers, jewelers, or higher up on the economic scale, hotel managers, arms dealers, oil exploiters, and so on. Even the depicted magnates and the captains of commerce, who are breathtakingly rich always, have in common with their less successful brethren certain faculties and characteristics which the authors of these writings emphasize. An innovative cleverness, we would use the word jarbigutun, which is given a negative spin, by which I mean transcending difficult circumstances through swindling and fraud. It is especially troubling to find one of the most popular writers in America, by which I suggest widely read and therefore contributing heavily to the image. This popular writer describing the thoughts of one of his characters who was about to meet his first Armenian. Quote, "I expected something dark and barbaric and greasy that rubbed its hands." Some image. And did you catch that last phrase, that rubbed its hands? In other words, not only not human, not his hands, its hands, but greedy, money-mad as well. The fact that writers such as this often project Armenians as likable rogues does not minimize the damage. In every instance, Armenians come off as economically driven, superficial, often living on the surface of life, lacking depth, without any resemblance to the great civilization they always talk about. In brief, Armenians come off as unsophisticated and uncultured. Armenians in America, unsophisticated and uncultured. How often are we filled with pride to see those Armenian names come before the public? Names like William Soroyan in literature, Rupen Mamulyan in movies and theater, Arshil Gorky, the founder of an entire American school of painting, Rupen Nakyan in sculpture, Alan Hovhannes in music, Diran Alexanyan, the foremost cello teacher in America, Rupender Arutunyan, a very prominent theatrical designer, George Dukmedjan in national politics, and so many others with whom this audience is familiar. And abroad too, on the international scene, Charles Aznavour and Aram Khachadurian and Gregory Cardinal Ahajanyan, who almost became Pope. Can you imagine what that would have done to our image, an Armenian Pope? And let us be truthful, no matter how we felt about his politics, who of us did not take some little pride in Anastas Mikoyan because of his ethnic heritage? Look at this from another standpoint. The largest ethnic group in the United States is, would anyone like to guess? That's right. How do you know that? 1/4 of the population, 60 million. Germans. The Germans are the largest, yes. Who's second? Irish. The Irish are second, the English are third. Yeah. Irish 15%, the English are 13, and the African Americans are 10. Very far down on the list. In fact, the Armenians comprise less than 1%. Actually, only 0.004% of the entire population. And yet, this tiny minority contributes substantially and with ever-increasing frequency to American society, especially to the arts and sciences, and more recently even to politics. And by the way, whether you agree with him or not, our compatriot, Dr. Jack Kevorkian, a man of principle and courage, I must say, has brought a troubling problem, which was always spoken about only in whispers, to the forefront of America's attention. I've never seen him referred to as an Armenian, and because his nickname is Dr. Death, maybe we ought to be grateful for that. I don't know. You know, 2 nights ago, I was in Washington, where I live, and they showed a 1-hour program on Kevorkian. Have you seen it here? Yes. It was last night, Frontline, called the Kevorkian File. Right. Also, I'm sorry? Right. That's right. And I want to say, you know, I have a certain ambivalence, you know, about this whole thing, whether, I mean, I think I was a little bit happy that they mentioned it. As we have seen then, this tremendous vitality and cultural diversity has not been reflected in depictions of us, whether in American literature or in the informational and entertainment media, thereby contributing to the distortion of the image of Armenians which the American public has formed, neither in the United States nor, for that matter, abroad. Don't we Armenians share some of the blame for that? For instance, isn't it noteworthy that the best novel ever written about us, as far as the world is concerned, was not by an Armenian, but by an Austrian Jew, born, incidentally, in Prague? Franz Werfel's 40 Days of Musa Dagh, which was first published in German and informed the world of Armenian heroism and courage, became an immediate bestseller all over the world and in the United States when it was translated. Is it not equally noteworthy that the best film depicting our great national agony of 1915 was made, again, not by an Armenian, but by a Greek American? Elia Kazan has given us scenes in America that burn deep into our consciousness and make everyone relive the agony and the horror of the Anatolian catastrophe. Speaking of Greeks, let's consider that just for a moment. And I do this because Greeks and Armenians have much in common. A time-honored civilization and culture, an autocephalic church, an ancient and a modern language, and strong ethnic solidarity, and a fierce pride in being Greek or Armenian. The Greeks in America are thought of largely as restaurateurs. That's a very fancy word. Most of the Greek restaurants you and I frequent are small diners or souvlaki stands. Now, does that mean that in Greece, most Greeks own restaurants or tavernas? Of course not. That would be ridiculous. Most restaurants in Greece are owned by Greeks, which is natural, since Greece is about 97% Greek. But it would be absurd to ignore the fact that Greeks, like Armenians, are also architects, engineers, economists, politicians, doctors, lawyers, journalists, musicians, artists, educators. In other words, everything that is essential to a thriving society. Now, why is it that this side of our accomplishments is not known, is not a subject in literature, is ignored in the public media? I said before that much of this may be our fault. For one thing, we do have an exceptional national literature. But you know it, and I know it. Americans and other nationalities do not. Why? Well, this is a bit of a digression, but it is part and parcel of the problem. I'm now going to borrow some thoughts from a very wise Armenian scholar who lives in Berkeley, California. Perhaps some of you know or have heard of Anne Avakian, who has spent many years compiling information on Armenian academic studies. In a recent publication devoted to Armenian dissertations, Ms. Avakian wrote, quote, "More than a dozen persons have written about William Soroyan, yet there is no special study of Rafi, the prominent and popular Armenian novelist of the 19th century. This situation exposes a problem that is mutual to the candidate for a degree and the faculty sponsor. Unless both have an adequate knowledge of the Armenian language and some Armenian history, Rafi and a number of other important topics will be neglected," unquote. The reason I said that this was a bit of a digression from my main theme is because the matter of translating Armenian literature of the past is a separate linguistic problem. But it is related to what we have been examining, because in translating Rafi or Alishan or Abovyan or Nalbanyan or Baronyan, we are not only conveying the depth and diversity of Armenian literature, we are also offering the outside world an inside look into Armenian society. After all, virtually every major serious writer has been translated into Armenian, from Shakespeare to Steinbeck, so why not the opposite? So now we come down to the central issue itself. What is there to be done in order to compose in the American mind an image of Armenians that is not only wholesome and stimulating, but also accurate? There are novels and short stories written by Armenians about Armenians, but they are primarily about Armenians in Armenian situations. I am thinking more about non-Armenian situations, where an Armenian finds him or herself in an alien milieu, or, in our case, as a component part of the American experience. Another way to put it is to say, an Armenian making it in the non-Armenian world. In doing so, does he lose his identity because of assimilation? If not, how does he retain it, his hayotun? What external factors compel him to recall and hold on to it? At this point, I confess to sounding very much like a sociologist, which I very definitely am not. Now, someone could readily say it's easy to criticize all this, but more difficult to do something about it. So, why haven't you? In other words, I would be challenged to practice what I am preaching. Well and good, that's fair. So if you'll permit me, I should like to explain what I have tried to do. By all measure, it's a drop in the bucket, but at least I have tried. I am the author of 2 published books, which Monaghan would have you know are available this evening. I have also just finished a novel, which is still in manuscript form. It has a long way to go yet before publication. The 2 published books are nonfiction, but are written in a narrative style. In fact, some reviews say they read like novels. The first book, entitled The Serpent and the Bees, is a personal memoir which tells of a 15-year pursuit of me by the KGB, the former arm of Soviet intelligence, a very, very long arm. 2 years ago, I spoke about this book at the Armenian Cultural Festival, and some of you may have been there. For those who weren't, I'll review briefly why I wrote it and what I tried to do. While I was still in active service in diplomatic life, I met an Armenian KGB officer in West Berlin. This was in 1963. For a year and a half, we met on both sides of the city, divided at that time by the just erected Berlin Wall. He attempted to bribe me into working for the Soviet Union, and specifically, as he put it, Ayastani Hamar. He had a very twisted view of my patriotism. I, of course, refused. This intelligence officer pursued me just about everywhere I went, even to Washington, and finally gave up when I met him the last time in East Berlin, where I was stationed on my final assignment. After my retirement, in reviewing the reports of those encounters, I decided they might make a story others would be interested in, not just Armenians, but Americans. I also realized that here, even in a story about espionage, there was an opportunity to do something about the Armenian image. Let me explain. In my many meetings with this KGB officer, who professed to be an informed and devoted Armenian, I discovered he was nothing of the kind. I would test him and soon learned that he was ignorant of some of the most foremost names in Soviet Armenian culture. For instance, he didn't know of Stepan Malkhasyan, the great Armenian lexicographer, or Manu Gaberian, the literary historian, or, and this to me was most striking, Aracha Ajayan, your old friend. That's right. I never heard of him, he said with great contempt. When I described some of the many remarkable works Ajayan had created, the 7-volume study of the Armenian language, or the etymological dictionary tracing the origin of over 5,000 Armenian words, he became annoyed at his own ignorance. He had never heard of Avaraj. He didn't know who Vartan Mamigonyan was, and was unfamiliar with Armenian history generally. And he asked me how I in America could possibly know all of this. These were, of course, duels of information, mind games. But even further, in 1967, my wife and I went to Soviet Armenia, and in one memorable week, we seemed to have met the most important cultural figures in Yerevan. Mardira Saryan and Minas Avedisyan, Yerevan Kochar, Kostan Zaryan, Sergei Paraganov, and many, many others, all of them dead now, as well as the art critics and curators Shahin Khachadurian and Henrik Igitian, who I think has come to Boston a few times. Earlier in my career, I had had encounters with the chess champion Tigran Petrosyan in New York, and composer Aram Khachadurian in Berlin, Budapest, and Moscow. Consequently, when 2 decades later I reviewed all these reports, I decided that writing a book about my experiences with this KGB officer would provide me a magnificent forum for informing the American reader of the historical and cultural achievements of the Armenian people. The reward for me has been the reaction of many American readers who have said that they had no idea of the cultural depth of the Armenian people. Most memorably, a former Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post told me, quote, "We correspondents in Moscow would occasionally go down to Yerevan and return with only a spoonful of information. You have come back with an ocean." And he added, "The story you tell is fascinating, but the section in Armenia is the most memorable part of your book." My second book, A Crime of Vengeance, which is an account of the genocide, is quite another story. I wrote this book for several reasons. First, there was, in my opinion, a huge void in the literature in English on this subject, and the few books on it were dense and unreadable. Second, there were these frequent news reports of the assassinations of Turkish diplomats repeatedly referred to as a blood feud going back to alleged claims of a massacre, and I thought that that should be corrected. Third, I had made a pledge to my father never to forget what happened in Turkey in 1915, he as a survivor. And finally, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to inform the non-Armenian public of the tragedy in an objective, dispassionate account based on hard facts culled from State Department cables, German Foreign Ministry archives, eyewitness accounts by missionaries, doctors, and engineers who were in Turkey at the time, and the newspaper reports of the period. One more reason, which emerged as I was halfway through the book, I thought that if American readers truly knew and understood what had transpired in Turkey in 1915, they would realize why Karabakh is of such importance. In other words, the need for unity and survival of the Armenian nation. For those of you who do not know the book, allow me to briefly tell you that A Crime of Vengeance tells the story of Solomon Tehlirian's revenge against Talat Pasha, whom he finds in Berlin in 1921 and kills. The framework of the book is the murder trial that follows, but in describing the destruction of Tehlirian's family, how he hunted down and killed Talat, the testimony at the trial of highly responsible witnesses, the findings of court psychiatrists, and Tehlirian's eventual acquittal by a Berlin jury. By means of all of this, I have tried to present to the reader as comprehensive and accurate a picture of all the elements entering into the tragedy, which are supported by the facts. My publisher says this book will have a long shelf life. In other words, it will be available for a long time because it will be continually discovered by Americans and Armenians. But I have received great satisfaction from quite another quarter. Many Armenian mothers and fathers have told me that they have been trying for years to inform their children of the Armenian tragedy, but without success. But now, according to them, this young generation of American Armenians is reading my book because it tells the story in a straightforward and readable manner they can understand. And a major contribution to that process was contributed by a very intelligent and perceptive review which was published in all of the papers, Armenian English language papers in the United States, by Armenian, sitting modestly there in the first row. This book makes a quite different contribution to the question of the Armenian image. It deals with only one aspect of our historical past, but one which has seared its way into our national psyche. Anyone interested in the Armenian people must, together with our history, religion, and culture, also know of our monumental tragedy in order to complete the picture and close the circle. Recently, author Jack Hashan spoke here, and according to the NAASR newsletter, you see I read it, he said that fiction was the surest way to publicize the genocide. He is right, and I agree with him, because it is often through entertainment that we can reach a wider public, even if the message is appalling. But when I wrote A Crime of Vengeance, I wanted to present readers with one work on the subject that was scholarly, incontestable, and a source for future writers on the subject. Although the subject was grim, I tried to present it in a flowing manner and with a strong storyline. Novelistic perhaps, but not a novel. So, in considering a new project, I decided to try writing a novel. I believe strongly that a writer is most convincing when he writes about things that he knows best. In my case, I combined an early involvement in musicology, for which I was trained, with a later career in diplomacy, which had taken me to Hungary, then a communist country in the Soviet sphere. My theme was the search for the missing manuscript of a cello concerto by Beethoven. I chose this theme for two reasons. First, Beethoven never wrote a cello concerto, and it was a challenge to prove that he did, and I think I did. And second, Beethoven had visited Hungary several times, early in the 19th century, and during my 4 years in Hungary, I had gathered much material on those visits. It might interest you to know that he composed parts of the Moonlight Sonata while he was in Hungary. Thus, I had the makings of an interesting story, but where, you might well ask, is the Armenian element? This is where the techniques of novel writing come in, a technique I had never studied, in which I had to learn as I wrote every day. The protagonist of this novel, the title of which, by the way, as Monica told you, is Opus, is an American-Armenian diplomat working in the American embassy in Budapest. He is the cultural attaché of the embassy. Some months after he arrives, he discovers that his counterpart in the Soviet embassy is also Armenian. The two cultural attachés get to know one another and engage in a friendly rivalry, until one day when the American reveals that he is searching for the missing Beethoven manuscript. The Soviet cultural attaché changes completely. He becomes strange and tenses up. It emerges in time that he too is interested in the Beethoven manuscript, but for quite different reasons. The American's interest is purely cultural. The Soviets is political. And as the story develops, it becomes quite complex. How could music composed almost 200 years ago be of such value to all of these elements? And how could it involve the intelligence agencies of 4 countries? You might still ask, how does the Armenian element fit in with this? Is it enough to have the 2 main characters Armenian? No, it is not. But I would prefer not to tell you any more because this is a suspense novel with a suspenseful climax. And someday, Monica, I hope you'll be selling them. Suffice it to say that as one of the other Soviet characters in a surprise appearance in the book comments, quote, events will show the importance of being Armenian. In this novel, it was my intention to portray Armenians as having higher interests and objectives than those suggested by the popular Armenian image. My main character lives in a very different milieu than his compatriots back home. In other words, as I said earlier, Armenians making it in a non-Armenian world. In Opus, I have projected a cultured and knowledgeable American Armenian into the world of diplomacy, where he experiences the clash of foreign cultures and ideologies, even as he performs his diplomatic role and makes his private personal pursuit. Yet despite his exposure to alien influences, he retains his hayotun, even while achieving success.
Thank you very much. So we'll give you an opportunity to be one-on-one with Mr. Alexander when we have our reception.